Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the ISS and this presentation of a new strategic dossier, a regional security assessment of 2014 key developments and trends in Asia-Pacific security. I say that we're here to present this to you because it was launched, this publication, in Singapore a couple of weekends ago when we held the 13th Shangri-La Dialogue, the Regional Security Summit for the Asia-Pacific, at which we were fortunate to have Prime Minister Abe of Japan, Chuck Hagel of the United States, a number of other key representatives from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, amid about 24 or so defense ministerial delegations to discuss regional security issues. And that Shangri-La Dialogue again really highlighted the degree to which the region is strewn with every form of strategic life, forms of conflict, security challenges. And this dossier is really an attempt to get to grips with some of the key structural features of the regional security landscape, the overarching trends and developments that we see, but also some of the contingencies and conflicts that have to be addressed as well. The editor of that publication and one of its principal contributors is Dr. Tim Huxley, to my left, who's Executive Director of the ISS Asia Office in Singapore. And I'm going to invite him to talk a little bit more about the objectives and the aims of the publication, and then perhaps to dwell on one particular theme that he wants to isolate and discuss. And then in the following sequence, I'll ask some of my other colleagues and contributors to talk about their areas, as it were. Christian Lemire, our Senior Fellow for Maritime Security and Naval Forces, is going to address the issue of the South China Sea and the East China Sea disputes. Nigel Inkster, our Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, will talk about the cyber dimension of security challenges in the region. And Rahul Roy Chaudhary, our Senior Fellow for South Asia, will talk a little bit about the new Indian government and the extent to which some of its foreign and defense and security policy preferences can be divined at this stage. And I'm sure we'll be happy to answer other questions as well. So they'll each present for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you for Q&A. So, Tim.
Thanks very much, Adam. This strategic dossier on the Asia-Pacific region is the first of what we intend to be an annual series of dossiers looking at Asia-Pacific regional security. It's grown out of the annual Shangri-La Dialogue, the Asia Security Summit. Last year, we moved to expand the Shangri-La Dialogue, or the SLD as we often refer to it, from being a discrete annual meeting into a rather broader process that has included establishing 2 Shangri-La Dialogue senior fellows in the ISS Asia office in Singapore, as well as setting up a Shangri-La Dialogue publication series that each year will include 2 Adelphi books on Asia-Pacific security themes, as well as a dossier. This one, we've called it the Regional Security Assessment 2014, Key Developments and Trends in Asia-Pacific Security. It's very much on the model of previous ISS strategic dossiers. It presents fact-rich analysis accompanied by a large number of graphics, maps, and tables. The issues on which this first strategic dossier in the Asia-Pacific series dwells are the most important themes which have emerged from successive Shangri-La Dialogues over the last 12 years, particularly the evolving regional roles of the major powers, particularly the United States and China, but also Japan, India, and others. The dangers posed by potential flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific, notably the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits, and the territorial disputes in the East China Sea and South China Sea that have been so much in the news over the last year, and transnational threats relating to maritime security, resource security, cyber security, insurgencies in Southeast Asia, and finally, what I would say are the crucial overarching questions of what sort of a regional security order is desirable and possible in the region, and also the question of military competition in the Asia-Pacific. I'd like to draw your attention to one particular chapter. My colleagues will talk about other aspects of the dossier. The chapter I'd like to mention particularly is chapter 13 on military modernization and arms racing in the Asia-Pacific. This chapter presents a detailed assessment of developments, particularly over the last year or so, in terms of military deployments in the region, military procurement, and military modernization, and the extent to which armed forces in Asia are pursuing successfully or not improvements in their military capabilities. And it emphasizes that military procurement, buying new military equipment, is not the same as enhancing military capability. It may contribute to enhancing military capability, but there are other important factors in the process as well. And the chapter also looks at the question of whether or not there is an arms race in the Asia-Pacific. It's a contentious issue. I think within the Institute there is a variety of views about this question of whether or not there is an arms race in the region. My own view, which I think comes across in this chapter, is that arms races may have characteristics that are unique to their particular political and technological environments. So therefore, when we look at what's happening in the Asia-Pacific now in terms of military developments, we shouldn't necessarily fall back on the argument that just because what's happening in the contemporary Asia-Pacific does not resemble what happened between Britain and Germany in terms of their naval arms race before the First World War, or because it doesn't resemble the Soviet-American missile race of the 1950s and 60s, that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an arms race in the Asia-Pacific at the moment. The third point I'd like to mention is that the Shangri-La dialogue that we concluded in Singapore about 12 days ago was a particularly successful Shangri-La dialogue, and we think that it marked a step change from previous dialogues in the series. And my own sense is that it reflected much more accurately the tensions prevalent in the region. I think it would be fair to say that the statements from the positions of the major governments at the Shangri-La dialogue were much more straightforward than in previous years. The dialogue was much more direct. Some would say that the gloves were off, but I think it certainly marked a new phase in the Shangri-La dialogue, and I'd be pleased to discuss that further or answer any questions that you might have about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Christian.
Thank you, Adam. I was going to discuss briefly the Maritime Domain, which is a theme that comes across very strongly in the dossier, and that's necessary because of the fact that it's a theme that's occurred regularly and with some immediacy in Asia-Pacific security in recent years. The dossier has chapters on the East China Sea and the South China Sea and maritime security, which obviously are all predominantly within the Maritime Domain, but also chapters on water and climate change, Taiwan, and even the Korean Peninsula, which have maritime elements to them. And in fact, when Tim talks about arms racing, much of the military procurement competition is occurring within navies and therefore at sea. This is perhaps unsurprising, the focus on the maritime in the Asia-Pacific, because as the name of the region suggests, it's very much a maritime region, and historically it always has been. But we're also seeing over the last 5 to 10 years what one might describe as a return to the sea by various countries in the region, Certainly those that were more focused on internal instabilities within Indochina, for instance, or even in China, are now more able and more willing to focus on their maritime peripheries and to focus on security within their maritime periphery in particular. A lot of the media attention has focused on the confrontation within the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but I think it's important to note that the maritime is not just a medium for confrontation, but is also a potential medium for collaboration and cooperation as well. So there's both good news and bad news about the maritime domain in Asia. Obviously, in terms of the confrontation side of things, the focus has been on the East China Sea and the South China Sea, primarily because these are currently the most significant outlets for regional tension and the most immediate security threats to some people's minds within the region. But equally, they are also becoming significant crucibles for great power confrontation and competition, particularly between the US and China, often through US proxies or US security partners such as Japan and the Philippines, who are seeing themselves increasingly at odds with China within the seas that divide them. The issue about arms racing, the issue about confrontation in the East China Sea and the South China Sea lends itself to the idea that there will be an inevitable conflict within Asia over these particular disputes. I think conflict is always possible, but it is never inevitable. And I think the strategies we see being used by most countries, and in particular by China, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, are largely dispute management strategies, combined with a desire to change the status quo on land and at sea within these disputes to shift international perceptions of who controls and administers these islands. So although we've seen a series of moves by China, including the creation of an air defense identification zone in November, the deployment of an oil rig, the construction on various reefs and islets within the Spratly Islands, all within the last 7 months or so. In reality, many of these are simply equalizing administration over the airspace and sea within the disputed areas. For instance, the constructions on Johnson South Reef by China, which are currently ongoing to build an airstrip, would actually make China the last nation or occupant to build an airstrip within the Spratly Islands. Every other occupant of those islands already has an airstrip somewhere within those islands. So to some extent, China's construction of that airstrip is simply equalizing its administration, although it may also be a precursor to an announcement of an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea, because it would give it the aerial capabilities to do so. But while there is some doom and gloom over the disputes themselves, there are also areas of cooperation and collaboration within the maritime. In particular, issues such as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief are very much the foci for naval and military collaboration within the region, particularly through ASEAN, but also independently and bilaterally by various countries in the region. And there are various shared security goals that are shared broadly among the various countries in Asia at sea as well. And this is brought out in a chapter on maritime security, where issues such as human trafficking, drug trafficking, even resource management are key to the security of various countries which are focused on the maritime. And dealing with those transboundary issues should and could involve greater collaboration and cooperation amongst various militaries and countries. The question is whether the political will currently exists to enable those confidence-building cooperations to occur. And while there is some evidence that is happening, equally, it doesn't seem to have completely shifted the balance towards pure cooperation as confrontation continues to occur in the seas. So I think we're likely to see the maritime as a continuing domain of interaction between the various states, both from a cooperative and also from a confrontational angle. And for that reason, I think it's very important to keep our analysis of the maritime grounded and realistic, and hopefully this dossier helps to do that.
Thanks. Nigel.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Cyber security as such was not a discrete topic at the most recent Shangri-La dialogue, but it wasn't very far beneath the surface, and I think that is in the nature of cybersecurity in today's world. It is a topic in its own right. It is an issue. It has become a domain in which both state and non-state actors are engaged in more or less constant contestation and conflict below the level that would rise to an armed conflict. But cyber, of course, is also increasingly a critical enabler for other forms of conflict. Weapon systems are increasingly cyber-enabled. Battle space awareness is increasingly cyber-dependent. And as we saw out of area recently in Crimea, information warfare combined with other capabilities has the capacity quite fundamentally to change the character of warfare in the 21st century. And the Asia-Pacific region is well and truly in the midst of this. We have within the Asia-Pacific region two of the world's major cyber powers, to wit the United States and China, and the relationship between these two powers has been very critically affected by developments in the cyber domain. The launch of this dossier coincided almost to the day with the first anniversary of the stream of revelations produced by rogue NSA contractor Edward Snowden, and it also came very shortly after the United States Department of Justice had unveiled grand jury indictments against 5 officers of the 3rd Department of the PLA General Staff, the Signals Intelligence Department, who had been accused of engagement in commercial cyber espionage on an industrial scale. And I can think of no single issue that has contributed to a decline in trust between the United States and China than the continuing unresolved issues over trading allegations of espionage and commercial espionage in the cyber domain. But it's not just these two. The Asia-Pacific region more generally is becoming increasingly cyber-enabled, albeit at a somewhat uneven pace. It includes South Korea, which has a credible claim to be the most wired society on the planet, Japan, which is also a significant cyber power, and we should not forget North Korea, a state where internet penetration is minuscule, but North Korea has been quick to identify the potential of the cyber domain as a vector for exporting the instability and irresponsible behavior in which it specializes. The ASEAN states, too, are devoting increasing focus on cybersecurity, and ASEAN as an organization, I think it's fair to say, is doing a very workmanlike job in developing approaches to promote common standards of cybersecurity, cert-to-cert cooperation within ASEAN and beyond, more effective collaboration and minimum standards. So cyber is out there, and we can expect to see it play an increasing role in the security of the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. So, Rahul, can you decode the Modi administration for us?
Well, that's going to be very tough at this stage. But what I thought I would do is to say a few words on some of the evolving dynamics of the new Modi government. And India is important also in terms of the dossier that we brought out. India figures prominently in several chapters on energy supplies, maritime security, and military modernization. But clearly, since the publication of the dossier, there has been a change in the government in India. This was not unexpected. Most observers and analysts felt that the change would take place. And we have the Bharatiya Janata Party, which was in opposition earlier, forming the government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But what took people by surprise, I think, was the sheer scale of the victory that Modi was able to achieve. For the first time in 30 years, a government in India has an absolute majority in the lower house of parliament. And this essentially, in terms of foreign policy, means that he can be bolder on foreign policy issues without the pulls and pushes of coalition politics, that the Prime Minister can also take his own decisions without being influenced by regional politics in India, and also will be able to steer a more effective and craft a more effective policy towards the neighborhood and the Asia Pacific. The national security team of the Indian government still is not fully in place. This is a work in progress, but there have been 2 or 3 important appointments that have taken place. The Prime Minister, of course, firstly, is very different from his predecessor. He's much more a hands-on person. He's been the Chief Minister of a province in Western India for over 12 years. And he seems to have taken a fresh approach towards dealing not only with his ministers, but also with the senior levels of bureaucracy in India. The External Affairs Minister is a lady who has been the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha for several years before Narendra Modi, when Narendra Modi was was ruling the state of Gujarat. She has been a former minister in the previous BJP-led government in the late 1990s. And my own sense is that her appointment and her power and influence within the Cabinet Committee on Security will provide the Indian Ministry of External Affairs a far greater role in foreign policy decision making. There is a new National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, who is a former chief of the Domestic Intelligence Agency, whose focus, my sense is, will be on counterterrorism and the neighborhood. So what does this really mean for India? I mean, one of the problems we have at the moment is that there is no full-time defense minister as yet. This has been a surprise. Most people expected that this government would have a full-time defense minister, but at the moment, the finance minister is holding the additional charge of the defense ministry. But perhaps for a short time, it doesn't make much of a difference. There is a view that there will be a cabinet reshuffle later this month where a new defense minister will be appointed. But the reason I said that for a short term it possibly doesn't make a difference is that tomorrow the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, will make his first visit outside the capital since he's been sworn in as Prime Minister on the 26th of May. And this will be to go aboard the recently acquired Indian aircraft carrier, the Vikramaditya, which was recently acquired by India from Russia. This is the largest aircraft carrier that India has. The Prime Minister will spend a day aboard Vikramaditya tomorrow. And it's interesting that this actually signifies, I think, the importance that the Prime Minister is likely and the Defense Minister, when appointed, is likely to give to defense, to the Defense Ministry and defense policy issues. There is also, I think, a sense that in terms of the relationships that India will have with countries, the neighborhood becomes more important than before. In an unprecedented manner, on the swearing in of the Prime Minister, the heads of government of the SAARC country, the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, and Mauritius were invited to attend. Most of them did, and the first meeting between the Indian and the Pakistani Prime Ministers took place the day after the swearing in. This meeting was not expected to be substantive, clearly, because it's very difficult to have a substantive meeting within 24 hours of taking over as Prime Minister, but it, from all accounts, was a meaningful meeting. And we see that there will be a meeting of the 2 foreign secretaries to restart the peace process, the dialogue that has stalled for nearly 2 years now. The first non-SAARC foreign minister to visit India from the P5 was China. The Chinese foreign minister visited India and met Prime Minister Modi as a special envoy of the president. There is clearly a sense that India's relationship with China is going to change tactically, possibly in the sense that it could require and could involve more investment from China into India and vice versa, but also at the same time a clear sense that on issues of military modernization, India will continue a policy of ensuring that it is adequately equipped vis-a-vis China and the line of actual control between India and China that is disputed. The Indian Prime Minister's first foreign visit will take place to Bhutan later this month. I think this again signifies the importance that he is going to give to the South Asian neighborhood. There is also a visit planned for Japan later on in the next few weeks. So essentially, these are still sort of early days in terms of the foreign policy perspectives and defense perspectives for the new Modi government. But there is clearly a sense of excitement in Delhi. I was in Delhi the whole of last week following some of these developments. And the question, of course, is, and the key question to me is that, the expectations for the new Prime Minister are so high that it is going to be very difficult to fulfill them domestically and in terms of foreign policy. But domestic affairs is where the Prime Minister's focus will be and the Indian government's focus will be for the next 2 to 3 years at least.
Thanks very much, Rahul. So there we've had 4 indicative vignettes, as it were, based on the content of the dossier. And I think now we'd like to just turn it over for questions and answers to you. We have about half an hour allocated for that. Either questions on what you have heard or things that indeed you've not heard, since there's a lot in the book that we weren't able to touch on in the initial presentations. First person to catch my eye was the gentleman here.
Thanks. Cho, Asian Pacific Affairs. A question more for Tim, I think. And Christian has already explained the situation in South China Sea. The situation is this: the Chinese bringing on this particular oil rig, the timing is rather interesting because Mr. Obama went to Asia with this APP, and the Chinese thought if you're talking about the partnership, we ought to be consulted anyway. And then there was an ASEAN summit going on in Naypyidaw very soon. And for this particular institution, Myanmar Foreign Minister Upana tried to feather down a bit of the tension. Surely it is not in the interest of China to be on bad terms with ASEAN anyway. There was a particular thinking that this is China's way of throwing down a gauntlet to tell the boys in Washington that we ought to be more in a position. I wonder what your thinking is, Tim. Is there any traction in this thinking, or where do we go from here? Because this particular oil rig is stuck with us.
Well, I think in terms of China's relations with Vietnam, certainly, and with the wider membership of ASEAN, the incident over this rig has been quite counterproductive, because I think it's part of a pattern of Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, which has put Vietnam and also the Philippines in the position of being what you might call frontline states over the last several years. And although not all other ASEAN members by any means are also claimants in the South China Sea, to a greater or lesser degree, most of the other members of ASEAN have an interest in demonstrating at least a degree of ASEAN solidarity, because ASEAN has a much wider significance for them. And so I think that China's behavior in the South China Sea, exemplified by the drilling rig incident, is actually pushing ASEAN gradually towards closer cohesion and coordination, and also encouraging individual ASEAN members to play some role in supporting the US rebalance to the region and in some cases enhancing their security relations with Japan and Australia and other friendly countries in the broader region. So in terms of China's overall role in the region, I think it was a rather counterproductive step. But Christian might want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on the timing of it and whether there was any particular reasoning behind the timing. I think it's impossible to gauge the motivations behind some Chinese decision-making because of the black box of Chinese politics. There could be political reasons tied into Obama's visit to Asia at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. There could be operational logistical reasons to do with exactly where the rig was and the weather at the time. The rig is scheduled to leave the area in mid-August, and there's no reason to doubt that would happen. There could be practical reasons with the fact that they had built $1 billion rig and they just weren't using it, so why not put it to some, at least political use? It could be a combination of these, it could be none of these. So I think it's pure speculation to say the rig was there because of Obama's visit to Asia or because of the ASEAN meeting, but it's not impossible that these could have played a part in the decision to deploy at that time.
Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you, Rahul Chaudhary. You have summed up the recent development in India. The landslide victory of Narendra Modi actually given him the power to make so many reforms. And the last BJP government, its relations with Pakistan started the peace process. But after that, immediately after that, there was a Kargil war, Kargil conflict. So the present government, so far as foreign relations is concerned, he invited Nawaz Sharif, and there was actually on the swearing day, he had good approachment with with Pakistan. But as regards the domestic issue, there are three issues which will bothering the minorities in India. Which is agenda, RSS agenda, and also the BJP's manifesto. The Uniform Civil Code, Article 370, which deals with the Kashmir, and the building Lord Ram Mandir in the Ayodhya. So what is your observations on these three issues and while the BJP government will deal with it? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, these three issues are featured in the election manifesto of the BJP, and then it's not surprising that they are in the election manifesto, but they are not in the president's speech. And that again is the first sort of official indicator of where the government wants to go on some of these issues on both domestic and foreign policy. There have been concerns expressed by the minorities in India on these issues, but I think it's indicative that when the new Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office, Jitendra Singh, mentioned that there may well be consultation on the abrogation of Article 370, he was met with tremendous opposition publicly and within the government, and there was a clear sort of signal from the Prime Minister that he should be silent on these issues because this was not the time to look at it. And he then came back and said that he'd been misinterpreted in what he said. So my own sense is that that these issues are part of the RSS and the sort of the links with the BJP as a party, but in terms of government, how serious will the Narendra Modi's government be toward these issues? My sense is that they will not be looking at these issues with any sense of priority. They will be secondary issues. The focus for Narendra Modi's government is very clear, and that is development, development, development. And it just is very unlikely that these will figure in any substantive way for the new BJP government.
Further questions? Yes, gentleman in the second row. Anybody else? Please keep your hand
Thank
up
you.
so we can note you down. Yeah.
My hearing's not always what it should be, and I apologize if I missed it. But I didn't hear any mention of North Korea. What do you think what role do you think North Korea wants to play in the area, and what effect is it having? For instance, its expansion of its nuclear arsenal.
Well, there is an extensive chapter on this in the book.
Sorry.
But I think the role it wants to play is primarily one about survival, and the entirety of its diplomacy and of its military programs are obviously directed towards that objective. I think the dossier details very carefully the technical developments that have happened in respect of the nuclear program. It deals also in some detail with the rather unfortunate diplomatic process, where I think we have to be very pessimistic about the possibility for any kind of a breakthrough on those particular issues. But I would simply urge you to refer to the book and get a slightly more insightful appreciation of it there.
So its role is essentially defensive.
I'm sorry?
Its stance is defensive then.
In the first instance, yes, but it is obviously also trying to extract a variety of strategic rents from its immediate vicinity, and it does that by brandishing the threats that it can pose to the region. And it does that in respect of its nuclear program, in respect of its missile program, in respect of the assertive position that it's taken in terms of its own military maneuvers. These are intended to provoke reactions, but I don't think that the North Koreans as such are looking to export their revolution to other parts of their immediate vicinity. It's about survival in the first instance. Gentleman in the back, could you just put your hand up so the microphone can reach you?
Timothy Coley, Talos UK. Dr. Huxley, you mentioned at the start about the sort of lack of connection between procurement and capability. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, particularly in the maritime domain, and speak about whether the naval forces that are being built up are essentially hollow forces that are more for show rather than for actual deployment.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I suppose two main points in response. One is that it is very difficult and I think dangerous to generalize about armed forces across the region, because they vary so widely in terms of the levels of funding from which they benefit, their absorptive capacity for that funding in terms of how effective they are in their procurement processes, and so I think one would have to distinguish between those armed forces in the region which are being seriously funded by their governments and encouraged to develop real capabilities, and those which are rather, as you put it, empty. And I certainly wouldn't use that description, empty, across the board in the Asia Pacific region. I think particularly in Northeast Asia, the governments, armed forces, and more specifically navies are determinedly building their capabilities across the board. And clearly there are particular weaknesses in some countries and particular strengths, but it's clear that in China, Japan, South Korea, there are really determined efforts to build naval capability across the board. I'm not sure that you could say the same about Southeast Asia, where defense budgets are generally much smaller than in Northeast Asia, and where the level of seriousness amongst governments and armed forces in developing what you might call credible capabilities for external defense and for the deterrence of external threat is really not so evident. But then, again, even in the Southeast Asian context, I think it's dangerous to generalize that one can see examples of countries and armed forces and navies in Southeast Asia which are very serious. And I'd point, of course, to Vietnam and to Singapore, and to a lesser degree also to Indonesia. And then turning to the, secondly, turning to the question of capability, what else goes into capability apart from equipment? And my assessment would be that equipment on its own does not give you any capability. Equipment is just is metal. But if you add training, if you add appropriate logistics, if you add a local defense industry which is able to provide maintenance and support and to modify and customize equipment for particular national needs, if you have high morale, you have well-paid and motivated personnel, you have good leadership, you have if you're trying to develop joint service capabilities and coordination, if you're developing a unified command and control organization, and if you're supporting your main armed forces with appropriate cyber capabilities and information warfare and electronic warfare capabilities, then you're beginning to develop a real capability. And I'd say that is the case for the big countries in Northeast Asia and for a selected few amongst the Southeast Asian countries.
Other questions? Did you want to add anything to that, Christian?
No, I mean, I think that was very comprehensive and very well elucidated. I think the point that I would perhaps elaborate on is that there are a variety of capability gaps within all the militaries within Northeast and Southeast Asia. So whether it's apt to describe some of them as hollow or just as having greater capability gaps than other militaries is the key question. I think what's important is that some procurement is designed to fill these capability gaps. Other procurements are designed specifically to build capacity and capability in areas that are clearly targeted towards other countries. And obviously submarines in East Asia is one key area of that, particularly with the Vietnamese kilos, which do seem clearly designed to, if not deter, then certainly disrupt China's increasing surface dominance within the South China Sea. So even in those areas where navies are concentrating large amounts of money on specific capabilities and could therefore lead to charges of neglect of other areas of capabilities, the important aspect is that there is a clear bilateral military competition in those procurements, and how that affects the security dynamic is part of what the dossier is focused on, and whether we are seeing military procurement competitions that are becoming uncontrollable or unsustainable.
Just to help complete that picture a little bit, I'm going to ask Rahul Roy Chaudhry, who's leading a project at the Institute looking at the developments in Indian maritime posture and capabilities, to maybe bring that South Asian perspective in as well.
Sure, Adam. I think when we look at the role of the Indian Navy in Asia-Pacific security, there are 2 or 3 recent developments that are important. The first is that the Navy's profile has increased in Southeast Asia, the Asia-Pacific, and also part of the Indian Ocean in terms of the recent acquisitions that it's made. I've talked briefly earlier about the Vikramaditya, the aircraft carrier acquired from Russia. There have also been acquisitions in terms of maritime surveillance aircraft, the Poseidon from the United States, destroyers indigenously built, and a nuclear-powered attack submarine from Russia. So in many ways, in the last sort of 3-4 years, the profile of the Indian Navy has significantly changed in terms of where it sees itself heading. Secondly, the Indian Navy has taken, I think, an important step, and there is no turning back from this, in playing a role by being taking on more responsibility for security affairs of the Indian Ocean. We have today the concept of the Indian Navy being a net security provider to the Indian Ocean island states, including states as far away from the Indian coastline as Mauritius, Seychelles, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, of course, and others. This is significant because in the past, the Indian Navy, as you all will be aware, has been very coy. The Indian government has been very coy about being seen to take on a larger role. But clearly, the geostrategic environment in the Asia Pacific that we've been talking about has significantly changed. There is a sense that the Indian Navy's capabilities can be useful to help provide security to these states, and this is done through the supply of patrol boats to some of the island states, provision of maritime surveillance of their exclusive economic zones, and most recently, very significant trilateral maritime security cooperation among India, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, which could also at a later stage include Mauritius and Seychelles. This is the second, I think, key development that's taken place in terms of the Indian Navy's own interest in the Indian Ocean. The third key development is that there is now much greater awareness, possibly, I would argue, concern as well, over the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean. There is clearly in the Indian Navy's published doctrines concern that emanates in terms of the Chinese Navy's activities within the Indian Ocean, support in various forms to Indian Ocean island states, and of course in terms of the enhanced capability that we've seen the Chinese Navy demonstrate in the Indian Ocean through the counter-piracy operations of the Gulf of Aden. Having said that, I think there is also a very clear sense that the Indian Navy sees itself as part of a larger grouping of countries. It is building bilateral relationships and networks with several navies of the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific, including the United States, Singapore, Japan. Japan is particularly important, and I think will be even more so with this with the Narendra Modi government. Because of his own personal inclination towards Japan, the sense that the two prime ministers, Modi and Abe, see things in a similar way in terms of not only the domestic priorities but also their aspirations in the near abroad. So I think we're looking at a sense of a developing sort of relationship between India and some of these naval forces. The key questions really are twofold. A, whether the Indian Navy is able to develop a balanced force in the near term or not. The reason I say this is that while there have been some of the acquisitions I've talked about, there have also been tremendous shortcomings, especially in the conventional submarine force, where there's been a drastic reduction of the number of submarines the Navy has been able to operate. As you're aware, there have also been two accidents aboard Indian conventional submarines, which resulted in the sinking of one of them, and there was a fire on another. This was partly due, I think, to a sense of the increased operational requirement for the submarines, but without the logistics or the personnel support for this. So I think that's one key shortcoming. The second key shortcoming really is in the manner in which the Indian Navy is able and the Indian government is able to take the next step towards developing these relationships. The reason I say this is that the government has so far been very coy about building a quadrilateral sort of relationship with similar-minded navies, for example, the US, Japan, Singapore, and India. This has happened once before, and after that, this was over about 8-9 years ago. What will be interesting, I think, the next few months will be to see whether the elements of a quadrilateral sort of relationship between India and these countries actually take off or not. At the moment, it's not clear how far this will go, but my own sense is that with a visit by Narendra Modi to Japan, we may well see a far more active role of the Indian Navy in Asia-Pacific security.
Thank you. Gentleman in the second row here.
Should the heightened tension and increased use of aggressive language between China and Japan give any cause for concern?
Nigel.
Well, I think it was pretty clear that, Tim mentioned that this most recent Shangri-La dialogue was qualitatively different from those that had gone before in terms of putting the underlying tensions of the region out there in the open. And I think that the keynote address of Japanese Prime Minister Abe was a critical, shall we say, catalyst in that process. So yes, I think that there are some real issues here. Particularly if you're a Marxist, there is nothing more unpredictable than the past. And history, I think, has become a kind of major irritant in the relationship. From the Chinese perspective, Japan's perceived failure fulsomely and fully to acknowledge its excesses during the Second World War, and Prime Minister Abe's professed desire for Japan to move beyond the baggage of the Second World War. These are difficult things to trade off. I think it's becoming clear that China is increasingly concerned, that Japan, is in the process of being, sworn in as the sort of USA's regional deputy in the region, and that is, also a matter for concern. That perception, of both sides, showing greater assertiveness, over issues like the island dispute. I remember I was in China in the early 1980s when Sino-Japanese diplomatic relations had just been established, and at that point they really were remarkably good. Since then we have seen a very significant deterioration. Now I think both parties have a significant interest in not allowing this deterioration to get completely out of hand, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are significant countervailing pressures at work here, not least I believe China's continuing emphasis on the need for regional peace and stability in order to achieve its economic development agenda. So I don't think that anybody is, there are significant constraining factors, but there is of course a worry that with this increasingly assertive and in some cases aggressive behavior, the potential for an incident that has escalatory potential is there. And I think is an increasing concern.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Hi, Sadamitsu from Jetro London. And could you make a brief comment on how do you analyze the U.S. commitment in the Asia-Pacific region? So we hear, pivot to Asia, but many observers see, not many is happening in that context, and U.S. commitment seems to be less determined. So how do you analyze that point, and is there any effect on the Chinese policy?
Tim, and then perhaps Christian as well.
Thank you very much. The question of the U.S. role in the region is a central consideration in the security dynamics of the Asia-Pacific, and it's featured year after year in the Shangri-La dialogue and the discussions there, and it features very heavily in this strategic dossier in several of the chapters. Through the U.S. rebalanced the Asia-Pacific over the last 2.5 years. Washington has repeatedly emphasized its commitment and has attempted to reinforce that declaratory element with modifications to U.S. military deployments in the Asia Pacific. It's also made sure that the U.S. has become an active player in the East Asian Summit and other aspects of the regional architecture. And the U.S. has also, I think, quite consistently reiterated its commitment to its allies in the region, including notably Japan, and has also attempted to bolster its security relations with existing security partners and countries that have the potential to be new security partners, and at the same time has put some effort into trying to stabilize its relations with China and to build more substance into its bilateral relationship with China. And I think overall that U.S. policy has been conducted with considerable success within its own parameters. However, I think there are two big question marks in the view of many Asians looking at the U.S. role in the region. One is the question of whether the U.S. is going to be repeatedly distracted by developments elsewhere, whether those are developments in the Middle East relating to the Middle East peace process, or to Syria, or to Iran, or whether new threats emerging to European security will pull the U.S. back towards NATO and Europe. And we've seen over the last couple of months a major problem in relation to Russia and the Ukraine. And the second reason for doubting America's longer-term commitment is the question of whether the U.S. will be able to afford its commitment to the Asia Pacific, whether the resources, particularly for the military component of the U.S. commitment to the Asia Pacific region, will be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all very true. I think it's useful to analyze the pivot or rebalance in a number of ways. The U.S. commitment to the region can be seen through the lens of equipment or through the lens of resolve. In terms of the former, it's important to remember the rebalance is not just a military rebalance, but also a diplomatic and economic one. And issues such as the TPP and the failure to have TPP finalized, the blame for that lies perhaps not at Washington's door, but more at Tokyo's door, or rather at the very many doors of Japanese farmers who are unwilling to cede tariffs on agricultural products. But nonetheless, there is a clear desire for the US to be more present, more engaged, and more influential in the Asia-Pacific region diplomatically and economically. The second is that the military pivot to Asia has in fact been happening for more than a decade. If we look at the creation of Guam as a significant submarine hub for the US, so the unfortunate aspect for the US is that when the pivot was announced in late 2011, early 2012, in reality, much of the shift of US forces had already occurred, so there wasn't little to really announce. So for that reason, the military pivot to Asia does seem somewhat lackluster, and the actual shift in military forces is very meager. It's more of a rebalance within Asia than it is a rebalance to Asia in many ways, with the withdrawal of Marines from Okinawa and stationing of Marines in Darwin, Australia on a rotational basis, greater rotational presence in the Philippines, and the forward deployment of littoral combat ships to Singapore. The problem for the US is obviously that it's facing a difficult budgetary environment, and there are continuing commitments elsewhere in the world, as Tim pointed out. In terms of resolve, I think the difficulty for the US is that faced with this difficult budgetary environment and some element of war weariness at home, it's challenging to persuade the US population and indeed the political elite that more robust military responses may be necessary. And it's particularly challenging because the strategy and tactics used by China in its near seas in particular are designed to avoid direct confrontation and are deliberately using unarmed or lightly armed paramilitary or constabulary vessels rather than naval vessels wherever possible, so that any military response by the US may be seen as overkill or as too aggressive. If we compare it to, for instance, the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996, where there was a clear military aspect to China's assertiveness through missile tests and maneuvers in Fujian and in surrounding provinces, it was therefore very much legitimized. It therefore very much legitimized the deployment of 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the vicinity around Taiwan. A similar deployment to the South China Sea currently may be seen as too aggressive, given that China is really just using unarmed constabulary vessels, albeit in sometimes dangerous and very assertive ways. But that doesn't mean that the US doesn't still remain committed to the Asia-Pacific region, or doesn't have the resolve to react militarily when necessary in support of its allies. It's just that the threshold has not been crossed for that kind of response to be necessary thus far. So while I can understand that regional countries may be concerned by the US resolve because of the seeming lack of commitment of equipment, in reality I think the resolve within Washington is probably more robust than regional countries are willing to accept.
Thanks very much. That, I think, concludes the formal portion of this event. I'd just like to say that accredited members of the press can collect a copy of the dossier at the back of this hall. Members for today only can benefit from a 25% discount. Non-members can also benefit, but only from a 10% discount, which is perhaps another reason to become a member of the Institute. My colleagues here will be, I'm sure, happy to engage you in terms of any other questions that you've got at the end of the formal segment here, but for the time being, thank you for coming, and we hope that you get some benefit from the book. Thank you.